bit on the further diversification of the profession. So we're going to finish up today by talking a little bit about the other side. So we talked about gender in architecture. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of race in architecture, specifically in the context of the United States, since we've kind of been following that trail of the AIA. So we're going to be taking a look at 4 architects today, and then we're going to be taking a look at one speech. 2 of the architects, or 2 of the figures that we're going to look at today are on your exam, 2 of the written pieces. So we're going to analyze a little piece of one of them today. Before your exam on Thursday, I do heavily, again, encourage you to actually read the documents. I know they might be a little bit lengthy, but I promise you they're really interesting reads. They're actually still very relevant to today in some aspects. And then hopefully you guys saw my announcement on Saturday that your collage number 2 isn't going to be due until after spring break. So I gave you guys a couple more days to work on it, just because I don't want you stressing about midterms and mid-crits and then an exam and a collage for my class. So we'll leave the midterm as is, which is assessment 2, and then we'll just move the collage over. That being said, your Vegas collage is going to be opened, I think, on like Friday or Saturday for signups. I encourage you to actually go out to your site, look at it, document it. A lot of these are not pieces that are super well known. And the point of the course, or the unit in the course, is to highlight those specific pieces. So to go out there and actually photograph them yourself and use those images in your collage will actually help you a lot. But keep in mind that once we come back from break, it will only have around 2 weeks to actually work on that. So just budget your time accordingly. Okay. So today we're going to be starting with the story of 2 architects, Julian Abel and Louis Magaziner, both of which went to the University of Pennsylvania. So Julian is right here on the front row, and then Lou Magaziner is right here all the way on the right side of the image. So Julian is famous because, or he's actually not famous. He's actually not a very well-known name, but the reasons that he's known by some people is because he was the first African American to be accepted into UPenn, which is one of the Ivy Leagues. And you can see just by the image itself, at this point, women are still not really allowed into the university. Julian is the first African American, and then Louis is actually one of the first Jewish students that's allowed into the school. And so when it comes to actually living their life as students, Julian is not allowed into the same dorms as the rest of the students. He is not allowed to dine in the same places as the other students. And so he has to go through lots of loopholes in order to attend the University of Pennsylvania. And then Louis, who is allowed into the dorms, is still ostracized from the rest of the group. So what happens is the 2 of them, when you get to do partner projects, like many studios still do today, no one wants to partner up with them, and so the 2 of them come together and they become lifelong friends because of the fact that the 2 of them are, again, ostracized from the larger class. And what ends up happening is that Julian and Louis come out as the 2 top students in their class, and then by the end of their 4 years at UPenn, Julian is actually selected as class president by the rest of his peers because he is such an outstanding designer, and he very often beats all of them when it comes to competition. So he emerges as the best in his class. So some of the quotes that we'll be seeing today are actually from Lou's son, who wrote a piece on the relationship that his father and Julian had while they were in school. And what he says is that during Lou's last 2 years and Julian's first 2 at Penn, the Jew and the African American joined forces. Both did beautiful work, they became buddies, they ate lunch together, attended the football games together, and developed a friendship which was to last through their lives. Once again, because of whether it was through discrimination of race or on the basis of religion, they had to come together as the only 2 people that no one wanted to partner up with. And in the end, they actually both became quite successful. This is one of the earlier pieces by Julian Abel. It's very small. It's a gateway at a college. And he won this commission through competition against a number of other architects. For a long time, no one knew who had actually constructed this because no one took the time to actually record it or put it in any history books. But a couple of years back, after doing some research, one of the students at Haverford College discovered that it was made by Julian Abel. and he gave it its appropriate plaque in order to commemorate that. He then went to go work with this architect, Horace Trumbard, who was also a Jewish architect, and he hired Julian because he understood the same struggles that him and Louis had gone through. And so this was the first office that he went to go work in. And while at that office, he worked on a number of different commissions, but one of the most notable things about his time here is that when he would travel to go visit the projects in different cities, he wasn't really allowed to stay in the same places as his fellow peers, or even in the projects that he would help design. He did have to always go to the African American quarter of town to stay there. And so when you think about transportation at the time and the efficiency of it, he would probably have to wake up a couple hours earlier than anyone else in order to be able to get to the project on time. And it goes to show the challenges that many architects in the earlier half of the 20th century had to go through in order to just practice. These are the steps at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, very famous terrace, famous place for protests, gatherings, all sorts of things. And for a long time, these steps, we also didn't really know who had designed them, and until recently it was discovered that it was actually Julian Abel. So a lot of his work remains clouded in mystery. There's probably lots of pieces out there that were made by him that we still don't know were made by him and haven't been attributed. One of his most famous commissions was at Duke University. He designed small pieces for them, several pieces throughout the entirety of the campus, including the actual chapel itself. So you can see that through his style, he does a little bit of neo-Gothic, neoclassical, neo-Renaissance. He's very adaptable to the style, and that's a trend that we're going to see in a lot of these early African American architects, is that they have to be quite adaptable in order to get as many jobs as they can, because they can't afford to be all that exclusive, right? Like Frank Lloyd Wright can say no to any commission he wants and still get a whole bunch of them. But when you are actively discriminated against in the profession, you can't really have the luxury of saying no, and so you have to be able to adapt to any style, to any program. And so we see that Julian's career and the buildings we do know that he created are actually all over the place, lots of different programs, and it's actually a great quality to have as a designer. And because of this, up until a couple of years ago, they rediscovered once again that Julian Abel was the person who had actually designed a lot of the pieces at Duke University, and they put his portrait up in the library, becoming the first portrait of an African American in the history of the university to be put up at Duke. And it was an architect, which is quite notable. Meanwhile, Lou Magaziner went on to design a couple of other pieces. Because he was Jewish, he also didn't get too many commissions. This was still before World War II, so there were still a lot of heavy prejudices against people of Jewish descent. And so a lot of his commissions mostly were related to the Jewish faith, a lot of synagogues, and so forth. And they remained friends for most of this. This is a building by Julian Abel. It is a club of sorts for the men in Pennsylvania, specifically Philadelphia. And a conversation that was held between the two of them that was recorded by Lou's son was, Louis said, "The other day I was in your Union League edition. It's really very handsome." And so Julian responds, "Thanks. But you won't believe it, I couldn't even go in through the front door because I'm black. I had to use the servants' entrance." And so Lou responds to him saying, "Well, I'm white, so I did go in through the front door, but because I'm Jewish, I can't actually join the club. But making you use the servants' entrance, and you were the architect, is really unforgivable." And yet this is really the common experience that many designers who were not of the white race in the early 20th century had to go through. And so through Julian and through Louis, whose works are still being uncovered today, we see that we have two architects discriminated on different bases, whether it's race or religion. And despite these odds, they always asserted that before anything else, they were artists. And they always wanted to be seen that way. Anytime that they gave an interview of the few that we have, they always asserted they are artists before they are anything else. And that is a common trope that we're going to see. And it's something that was asserted by the most famous of all African American architects, Paul Revere Williams. If you guys notice in my collage, there's this little sign that says, "I am an architect." That is a quote from Paul Revere Williams, where he asserts that before anything else, his identity is first and foremost as a designer and as an architect. So, here he is with his consultants. Paul Revere Williams went to the University of Southern California, USC, also one of the top universities, one of the first people in his class to graduate as an African-American architect, and he was also notably the first African-American in the AIA in 1923. So huge deal. He was able to get into this organization, and as we know, architecture is very slow to change. It's a very exclusive profession. So for him to get in as early as the 20s is actually quite extraordinary. Now, when he graduated, he was told by one of his advisors, where are you going to find work? Because you're not going to get hired by the Black community, and he said, in quotes, they're not going to commission anything, and then he said, and you're also not going to get hired by any white clients because you're Black. And Paul Revere Williams said, I don't know, but I'm going to find a way to do it. And so he goes through a couple of offices, and eventually he opens his own practice. And what we see is that, like Julian, he's very adaptable, and he uses several techniques in order to bring in clients in very, very subtle ways. So he has this couple of techniques which I'll go through. First of all, in his office, when you come in, there's a sort of lobby, and then he had a screen, and he would draft behind that screen. And then on the actual window, it would just advertise architectural services. And so when you had clients driving by, they would see, oh, that's an architect. They would come in, they would talk to the secretary or whoever was in the front about their project, and he would say, you know, we have the budget, we are ready to build, we have all the ideas, we're ready to see the architect. At that point, Paul Revere Williams comes out from behind his desk, and to the client's, you know, surprise, he's African American, and all of a sudden, their conversation shifts, and they start saying, oh, we're just shopping around, we're not really ready yet. We actually don't have the money yet, even though they had just said that they had the full budget to start the projects. And Paul Revere Williams, like I said, was very smart, and rather than, you know, taking offense to this or straight up telling him you can leave the office, he just said, well, come on in, I'll show you a couple of ideas, let's talk about it, no pressure, no strings attached. And that's the way in which he gained a lot of his clients in his early career. He would tell them, he'd give them a small idea, start sketching on napkins, and because he was such a great designer, more often than not, he did happen to actually gain them his clients, and that's how he got a lot of his early commissions. The other thing we see him do, which is also a very subtle move, but it helped him get a lot of respect from a lot of his white clients, were he would sit on the opposite side of the desk, right? So during this time, we did do hand drafting, and you had to sit next to the client in order to be able to draft right side up. And famously, Paul Revere Williams would sit on the opposite side, and he would have the plan facing right side up for the client. So he learns to draw upside down and draft upside down. And if you've never turned your own plans or your elevations upside down and drafted them, it's incredibly hard to do because you have this mental map of where everything is and the measurements, so to completely flip it upside down is really challenging, but it's one of the few things that he had to do in order to not make his white clients uncomfortable. And way, way, way later, in the 90s and 2000s, once we started, you know, digging up the archives of Paul Revere Williams and people started becoming interested in his legacy, his white clients were interviewed and they were asked, you know, how did you feel about the fact that he sat on the opposite side? And many of the clients, to the surprise of the interviewers, just said, I never noticed. I didn't realize he was doing it because he thought that I would feel uncomfortable. I thought that's just the way he did things. But if you look at any other standard architect, they would always sit next to the client. So he did a lot of really subtle moves in order to convince his potential clientele to choose him as an architect. Now, he eventually became known as the architect of the stars. So despite having all these odds against him, he became quite famous, and a lot of Hollywood actors and starlets decided to hire him for their own homes, including Frank Sinatra. So in 1956, he gets commissioned his home. Sinatra is sick of staying in hotels, and he hears about the talent of Paul Revere Williams, and he hires him, and he tells him, I want a home for an entertainer. If you don't know Frank Sinatra, he is a singer. And so he hires Paul Revere and tells him, I want you to put all the latest technology inside of my home so that I can impress and entertain my guests. And Paul Revere Williams gives him this beautiful mid-century home, and what he does is he creates a speaker system and integrates it within the walls, and then he does a triple insulation on the walls of the living room so that you can't hear anything anywhere else in the house. And so as Frank Sinatra is singing or, you know, he's playing a record, you can't hear it in the rest of the home. So very impressive construction technology for the time. There's a little bit more of a home. And then this is Frank Sinatra's bedroom. And if you notice, we do have a television over here, which swivels out of the millwork. And that was designed and detailed by Paul Revere Williams because Frank Sinatra liked to watch TV from his bed. And you can see that he has a whole sound system and audio system integrated into there. And so we can see that he's, once again, like Julian, able to really morph his style in order to fit his client's needs. If you want to know more about his homes, he designed all of these, all of which belong to famous celebrities from the golden age of Hollywood, 1950s, 60s, a little bit of the 70s. They're all in that, very iconic mid-century style. I'm only going over one of the most famous ones, but do know that he has all of these all over Southern California. On another note, he also designed the famous Beverly Hills Hotel, or at least he renovated it and gave it its very iconic facade. Oops. Let me try to reload it. All right, well, this was just a close-up image of the Green Wall where you see the cursive Beverly Hills text, which is also iconic of Southern California's mid-century movement. So this logo right here, to this day, it remains as is. They've tried to preserve it as best they can because today it's considered a very famous architectural piece because Paul Revere Williams was involved in it. On the interiors, he chose all the furniture. He did all of the millwork, where he designed all of the millwork. He chose the textures. So once again, he did all sorts of commissions in order to appease as many clients as he possibly could. And one of his most famous pieces is the LAX theme building, right? And so inside of this building, you have restaurants. It's basically a big overview tower of the LAX airport. He did design it in conjunction with a couple of other architects. And that's what we know today as the Goopy style. So the Goopy style actually comes from this diner in Southern California that had a little mascot that was an egg, and his name was Goopy. And it was the first building that is considered to have what we call a atomic, spaceship era type of architecture. So in the Jetsons, all of the pieces that they have are actually considered to be Goopy style. It's, very futuristic, a lot of sharp corners, a lot of like triangle-shaped pieces, hyperbola type pieces. And the concept was that now that we are in the era of the spaceship and the car, we need to design the future style of architecture. So if you've gone to like Disneyland's Tomorrowland or the future area, or even like the Cars Land, this is the type of architecture we're talking about. It is the 1950s concept of what the future would look like. And Paul Revere Williams also picks up on this style and he brings it over to Las Vegas. Okay. So this is the Guardian Angel Cathedral. I'm sure most of you have seen it. It's on the Strip. It's right next to the Encore in the Wynn. It is going to be on the list if anyone would like to take this building. And this cathedral was actually commissioned by Moe Dalitz. And if you don't know Moe Dalitz, he's one of the people that was rumored to be in the mob at the time. And so in order to clean up his image, he decided to commission a small cathedral, which was actually quite smart because owning a lot of the casinos, he actually had a lot of Catholic workers and employees. And so because they would take a little bit of time off in the middle of the day to go visit the closest church, he decided to build one for them, and so it served that dual purpose. On the one hand, he's cleaning up his image as a mob boss, and on the other hand, he's offering a service so that his employees don't really have to go that far in order to reach a church service. And we can see through his use of sharp edges, and then on the interior, the way in which the outer walls fold into themselves, he's having this sort of goofy quality, but in this case, he's putting it into a religious setting. And today it's probably the most iconic piece of Catholic architecture in Southern Nevada. He also famously designs the Concha. So if you haven't seen the Concha, it's on Las Vegas Boulevard. Today it is the lobby of the Neon Museum. But at some point it was the lobby for an actual motel called the Concha, which we see back here, located on the Strip. It was later picked up and then brought over to the Northern Strip where it was placed for the museum itself. There is the famous sign, which if you go to the Neon Museum, you can still see today. And we see that he's one of the first people to use fluid architecture. and parametric design, right? This was being done in Mexico by Felix Candela, and it was also being done by Paul Revere Williams. And the reason we don't see too much of this type of architecture anymore is because it's actually very expensive to produce because of the infrastructure. So you do have to create a huge structure out of iron underneath it, and to do that, you do need to have a lot of artistry, and then you have to pour a super thin shell of concrete over it. If you go visit it in person, it's really impressive. It's actually a lot thicker than it seems on images, but it goes to show when you're a really good architect, you can create these really cool illusions where it almost looks like this is paper thin. And then that's where it is today as the Neon Museum's lobby. So Paul Revere Williams has a super long career, and eventually in 2017, we've already talked about this, he is inducted into the AIA Gold Medal winners, and to date, he's still the only African American to have ever won this award. But his legacy shows us that despite being one of the most well-known, famous, and talented individuals of his time, he still had to be able to adhere to the standards, and he still had to jump through many loopholes in order to be able to practice. So we see that he goes above and beyond the expectations of a typical architect, not just in how he designs or in the amount of styles he can design in, but also in how he treats his clients and how he interacts with them. And it's because of that that he did become one of the most prestigious architects of his time. And recently he's been getting a huge spotlight put on him by the Neon Museum. There was a Paul Revere Williams exposition a couple years ago in the Nevada Museum in Springs Preserve that had all of his drawings, and it was actually just discovered that there was a whole community here in Las Vegas on the west side that was designed by him. So if you've been on Owens and like H Street or D Street, there's a community of houses there that was designed by Paul Revere Williams. And he actually had to stay there when he came to design the Concha and when he designed the Guardian Angel Cathedral, because he wasn't allowed to stay on the strip resorts. So many of the architects did have to go stay in the west side. Now the next two are going to be African American women, and we're going to see now the concept of intersectionality begin to play into the architectural profession. If you are unfamiliar with the term, all it means is that you have two different identities that are considered to be marginalized. So in this case, they are women, and they are also women of color. And so they do have to face both challenges at the same time. And it's a challenge, and we'll see in their own words, that they don't really know if they're being excluded because they're women or because they're African American. But we'll see how that plays out. So Beverly Lorraine Green goes to the University of Illinois, also a very famous university when it comes to their architectural program, where she graduates as the first African American woman, where she is on the third row. And once again, if you look at the photograph, I believe she is the only woman, and she's probably, it looks like, the only African American student as well. So she's also a pioneer in the field. And once she graduates, she practices in Chicago. And most of what she does is actually social types of projects, public housing. She works under another famous architect, Kenneth O'Neill, in Chicago at the time. And what we see is that she has this really, really deep, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the word. She has this deep connection, so to speak, with the concept of community architecture. So she doesn't like to really gravitate towards big commissions, in part because she's not allowed into them, but also in part because she feels a social responsibility to helping the people most in need in these communities. And so she's part of this project, which is called the Ida B. Wells Homes in Chicago. And this project receives a lot of scrutiny at the time because it was a community mostly made up of public housing, and it was going to be placed to a community that was a segregated white community. So you did have a lot of backlash and a lot of remarks towards the architects, including Beverly Lorraine Green, because of this. And despite that, she continued practicing in Chicago for some time. She did meet a lot of different walls that she honestly didn't really want to deal with, and so eventually she did relocate to New York City, where she believed that she would have more opportunities to practice. She designed, or she was part of the design team for this famous housing development, which was made to house the veterans that were returning from World War II. And this project was super controversial because it was only meant to house white veterans returning from World War II, despite the fact that there were a lot of African Americans that participated as soldiers in World War II as well. So there was a lot of critique from New Yorkers on the fact that this was still being made as a segregated housing community. And so what the developer did was they took Beverly Lorraine Green and they said, well, we're not being racist because we have a black female architect on the team. And so they used her in order to justify the fact that this would continue to be a segregated community for around the first 10 to 15 years after it was opened. So there's the original site. It was at this point really run down, a set of what were then urban tenements. So they cleared this entire area and then they built these up. Now, by the cruciform shapes and then the fact that they're put in a park setting, what famous architect do you think that they got this idea from? When we talked about the Masters of Modernism last semester and their urban ideas, yes?
Corbusier?
Yes, it is the towers and a park concept from Corbusier. So we do see that Beverly Lorraine Green is looking at some of his theories and they are following them and trying to apply them in order to create a community that uplifts the living conditions of the veterans that are now returning from the war, giving them some greenery. The idea that this can help improve mental health is becoming a thing. And this is what it looks like today. So we can still see that it is very green. They've actually redone the grounds a couple of times in order to modernize them, to give them more playgrounds that are more updated. And it's actually becoming the largest development with solar panels in New York City. Now, eventually, Beverly Lorraine Green does get to work with Le Corbusier, where she designs the UNESCO headquarters in Paris. So she's brought over with Marcel Breuer, another famous Bauhaus architect, and she does get to contribute to this design, which is part of her most famous work. And so we see that she made it quite high, but unfortunately, she did pass away when she was 40 years old, which is around the time that most architects' careers are barely beginning to blossom. So we don't really know how much more she would have achieved had she been able to live a little bit longer, but in the couple of years that we did have her as an architect, she did a lot of really notable commissions. So she wrote this a couple of years before passing away. It's called Women Architect Blazes a New Trail for Others, where she was asked, how do you feel about women entering, or African American women in particular, entering the field? And she said, I wish that other young women would think about the field. And she famously says, never did I have one bit of trouble because I was a Negro, although there have been arguments about hiring a woman. And this is where we see the conversation on intersectionality beginning to come up, where she believes that she was more actively discriminated because she was a woman in architecture than because she was an African American in architecture. And she encourages women to enter the field of architecture. One of those women we will look at in the next couple of slides. And so in Beverly Lorraine Green, we see an example of an architect advocating for her community through her work. So she doesn't just talk about the integration of people into these communities, she actually practices that. She designs communities and she fights for them to be interracial. She wants these communities to not have any type of restrictions when it comes to race. And so she's an example of what we're later going to see that Whitney and Young at the end of this lecture is going to be criticizing the majority of American architects for. Right? And then the last designer we'll look at today is Norma Merrick-Sklaric. So Norma Merrick-Sklaric is from Harlem, New York, and she attended Columbia University, another Ivy League. She was I believe, the first African-American woman to be accepted into Columbia's architecture program. She was the first licensed female African-American in the state of New York. She was also the first African-American woman in the AIA, and then she became the first licensed African-American woman in the state of California. So she was really a lot of firsts throughout her career. And when she left Columbia, when she graduated, she said that they weren't hiring women or African Americans, and she didn't know which one it was that was working against her. So she did go through a couple of years where she couldn't really find anywhere to work. And the few firms that did hire her would just make her do really menial tasks. She was eventually hired by this firm called SOM, Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, but she really only got to design a couple of bathrooms despite having a higher level of education than many of the architects that were at that firm. Now eventually, she decides to relocate to LA. And in LA, she works under an architect, Gruen Associates, and she becomes the first female vice president for that company because she has such a high talent when it comes to the tectonics of building. And by tectonics, I mean she's able to put together all the details, specify the materials. She knows how to put the building together, and that's a pattern that we see with a lot of the early female architects, is that the men in the offices usually do the more artistic work and the conceptual ideas, and then the women are left to figure out the more construction side of things. How do you actually construct it, put it together, detail it so that it works? And so what you'll notice in her work is that the materials she uses are highly industrial. She starts using a lot of glass, which is quite innovative for the time, because she's always being pushed to the latest innovations when it comes to tectonics of buildings. Now, when she got to this office, she didn't have a car, and so she would hitch a ride with a white coworker who would very graciously take her to and from work. But she said that it took only 1 week before the boss came and spoke to her about being late, because her coworker was always late. And she says, and yet he had not noticed that the young man who had been driving her had been late for 2 years. So her solution was to eventually buy her own car because she, as a highly visible employee, had to be punctual. And so we see that because she is the only African-American woman in the office, that, in her own words, does make her more visible to the employer, and she has to be perfect. There's no room for errors, whereas the rest of her coworkers can mess up here and there, and it's not really as obvious because their identity isn't something that the boss is, hyper aware of. So this is the style that she eventually becomes known for. Lots of curtain wall construction with glass, where we can clearly see the structure being expressed on the interior. And we can see the high degree of engineering that she also knew in order to put these things together. So she became the project manager in a lot of these cases. She worked in conjunction with some of the other major architects in the LA area. She did design the US Embassy in Tokyo, where we can see this beautiful, beautiful swing facade that she creates right here. And all of the credit actually went to the design architect, Cesar Pelli, when in reality it was both of them that designed it equally. But her name got erased off of the project because she was the one that was mostly putting together the construction documents. So eventually, Norma decides to open up her own firm, and this is the first female-owned or majority female-owned firm in the United States. So it's Siegel, Scleric, and Diamonds, based on their last names. They do struggle to get commissions for a couple of years. They do get projects here and there, but the issue is that with the scale that Norma is used to building in, which are these huge, towers and skyscrapers, the types of projects that they get at the Siegel, Scleric, Diamond office are actually really small in comparison, and she knows that her talents are not being used to their full potential. So she's eventually forced to leave because she just wants more ambitious projects. And she leaves the partnership. Well, if you guys can see the slide, it is one of the pieces that they worked on together when they were in the firm. And then they also designed the air traffic control for the LAX. So we have two pieces, the in-building and then the control tower, both made by iconic African-American architects of the 20th century. Now in 2008, I believe, she won what is called the Whitney M. Young Jr. Award because for the latter half of her career, she spent most of it advocating for women in architecture, for the introduction of more African Americans in architecture. She was a visiting lecturer. She eventually taught at many universities. She hosted many design charrettes and so forth. And so because of her advocacy within the profession, she was awarded this award, which you can see not only goes to individuals, but also organizations that help promote the diversity of architecture. And for the most part, it is going to be architects of color that are going to be advocating for their respective groups. And so in Norma, we see that we have an example of a woman who was facing those challenges of intersectionality, where she's not quite sure if the discrimination is on the basis of gender or her race. And yet, she still decides to put herself out there. She becomes a leader. She becomes a very well-known professional. And eventually, she becomes one of the first African-American female principals in the United States, which is very notable. And now we'll finish with someone who is not an architect, but who had a huge impact on the architectural community, and it's Whitney M. Young. So Whitney M. Young is a contemporary of Martin Luther King. He was one of the people who was a civil rights activist, and he mostly spoke up when it came to public housing. So he was hoping to pass acts that would have equal housing for people that were African American, because remember, at this time, housing loans were not given to people who were African American, and he was trying to advocate in order for those loans to open up for them, and also to improve the quality of public housing that was being made in the inner city. So here we see him over on the left, where in this case he is marching in Washington for just the end of segregation in general. Here we have him with President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Lyndon B. Johnson. This is him with the president. So actually, this is something that Lyndon B. Johnson did to everyone. He would come up to them and give them what was called the treatment, which basically meant that he got within like 6 inches of their nose, and then he would just talk to them with his eyes wide open, and it was a way for him to challenge his opponent and see if they were really serious about what they were proposing. So it wasn't just that he did it to Whitney M. Young, he did it to everyone. And Whitney M. Young, stood his ground, and because of that, he became really good friends with President Johnson, and he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom later down the line. But for the purpose of architecture, it is his 1968 speech at the AIE convention that really electrified the entirety of the profession. It left everyone speechless by the end of it, because he's one of the first people to address the AIA, not by praising them or by saying how great they are, but actually by calling them out for all of the bad things that the architects have done over the past couple of years. So we're going to read a couple of excerpts. This is part of your assessment too. You're going to read, it's like 12 pages. I promise you it's really interesting. I encourage you to read it fully. But we're going to go over some of the most famous snippets and break them down. So when he starts the actual speech, he begins by saying, "One need only take a casual look at the audience to see that we have a long way to go in this field of integration of the architects." So once again, this is 1968. We don't really have a lot of African American architects. And the few that you do probably were brought by their offices to the AIE convention, right? Usually it's just the principal and maybe a couple of the higher-ups that go to this. And so when he looks out into the audience, not many women and not many people that are not white here either. Then it goes on to talk about Hawaii, and this is one of the questions on your exam. So before I read the quote, the second half of the AIE convention was going to be in Honolulu, and he isn't invited to give a speech there, and everyone else that was giving a speech was invited to go with them to Honolulu. So he says in his speech, he says, "I'm not sure if I'm gonna," let me pull it up. I think he says something like, "I'm not sure if I'm going to formally accuse you of being racist, but I'm just going to call out that I was the only person of the speakers that was not invited to also go to Honolulu with you guys." And then he says, "But I don't need you guys to take me to Honolulu because I've been there myself." And he talks about his experience there, and he says that he was impressed with Honolulu in the short time that he was there because of the great diversity that he saw amongst its people. He says that he observed a real living democracy, diversity as far as homes are concerned, and people all mixing together. And then he tells the architects of the AIA, "Do not take over there what you've been, I think, a silent partner in developing this country. Just leave them alone." And then he says they've done very well without any of your architecture. So what does he mean by this? He's essentially accusing the architects in the United States of being silent partners in what is, at this point, the state of the US when it comes to the inner city, suburbs, public housing, all of the problems that the city is having today. He says that is the fault of the architects. Not necessarily because you're, actively doing these things, but because you're silent when it comes to it. And every one of these has an architect behind them. So even if as the architect, you don't believe in what these projects are upholding, you're still doing them. And in doing that, you're a silent partner in developing what the country is today. And that's really going to be the theme of the entirety of this speech, where he is calling out the architects, not for being, explicitly racist, but for partaking in policies through their silent agreement to be the architect. All right, and he tells them, you have a nice normal escape hatch in your historical ethic code, or something that says, after all, you are the designers and not the builders. Your role is to give people what they want. Because that was the argument that many architects put forward. They went, well, I didn't design this because I wanted to, it was because the the client or the builder told me to do it, so it's not my idea. And he says, calls them out and says, that's a really nice way to cop out. And he says, but I have read about architects who have had the courage and who had social sensitivity. And I can't help but wonder about an architect who's building some of the public housing that I see in the cities of this country. So he's calling out the architects that build public housing in that AIA convention for what they were making. And he says, I've heard that architects are supposed to be socially sensitive and have courage because, remember, one of the branches of modernism was that you are supposed to be creating a social change in society. You're supposed to be creating architecture for the betterment of everyone. And he's saying, yet, all that public housing you're making doesn't really do anything of that. And he says that the AIA is most distinguished in its thunderous silence and their complete irrelevance for their lack of any action. He then goes on to say, architects, you are powerful because you are employers, you are key people in the planning of our cities today. You share the responsibility for the mess we are in terms of the white noose around the central city. It didn't just happen, we didn't just suddenly get in that situation, it was carefully planned. And notice his use of words here, he did say white noose around the central city. What is happening to inner cities in the 60s and 70s at this point? We talked about this during our 20th century lecture. What happens to the inner city in the 60s and 70s? Yes?
The white population going out to the suburbs.
Yes, we have the suburbs being created, we have the phenomenon of white flight, and so the inner city becomes abandoned and it's no longer being funded, so a lot of the social services which were there are pulled out, and we see the decay of the inner city. The industries are pulling out, and so we see the absence of any jobs in the inner city. And he says that this wasn't something that just suddenly happened, it was deliberately planned and created little by little through all of these individual projects. He says it took a great deal of skill and creativity and imagination to build that kind of situation that we have. And so it is equally going to take skill and imagination to get out of it. And he's really calling for the architects to step up to the plate and do something about it at that point. So I talked about Pruitt-Igoe last semester, where I said that these types of developments were made under the guise of modernism and saying we're using modern materials and we're using Corbu's ideas. But when you really looked at it, it lacked all of the services that made Corbu's buildings the future of living, right? So remember, Corbu had a whole roof that had a park, that had amenities, it had childcare, it had pools, recreational needs. It had staircases on every level, elevators that went up to every level. It was really the model for living in the future. And when that gets picked up by public housing in the United States, they remove all of the amenities. They make it as cheap as possible with concrete and brick. They say it's modern housing, but because of the way that it's designed, it inherently fails. In Pruitt-Igoe, the elevator only goes up to every third floor. So if you happen to live on one of the floors where the elevator doesn't stop, you don't have to go through the stairwell. And because the stairwell is on the exterior and it's constantly thawing and freezing, it's a really dangerous place to be climbing up, especially in the winter. And so eventually Pruitt-Igoe does have to be demolished. And these projects are the reason why today, again, there's still so much stigma around the concept of public housing because people say, well, it doesn't work. But that's because when it was first constructed in the 60s and 70s, it was never designed properly. And one of the questions on your exam is going to be what happens when they go visit the public housing community with Whitney M. Young. And in his speech, he says that when they visit it, the people that were a part of the committee that was supposed to be reviewing public housing are just holding their noses the entire time because it smells like pee everywhere. And he tells them, you can't leave, like stop and observe why this is happening. And what they see is that as little kids are playing around, because they have to go up 14 flights of stairs before they reach the first public restroom, they'd rather just, pee around the building. And that's why it smells that way, because the architect didn't design thinking or having these things in mind. It was just designed to be as cheap as possible without thinking about how people actually live in these spaces. And so part of what he's also advocating for at the AIA convention is for the public housing developments going forward, the ones that are going to be done after Lyndon B. Johnson is president. He's asking the architects to design them properly, to think about the people that are living there, and to stop just cheapening out on the materials and listening to the developers who really just want to create the cheapest thing possible and say they got it over with. Now, to end this lecture, today we see that 1 in 5 architects identify as people of color, and this number is slowly going up, very, very slowly. It's going up slower than the rate of women in architecture, but we do see it going up, right? And that's because we do have a lot of these architects, Whitney M. Young, Beverly Lorraine Green, Norma Mayer-Sklarek, becoming advocates within their communities, right? The more that you speak up about it, the more that people are going to become aware. And we also see a lot of inner city programs that are opening up today that advocate for architecture in a lot of these schools in order to start teaching young people about the importance of our profession and start sort of whispering in their ear that they might want to become architects. All right. Does anyone have any questions on this lecture or on the assessment for Thursday? Yes. It's all what?
It's closed.
Yes, it is closed. Yeah, just bring a booklet to write on. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there a clarification on how the star system has been changed to modern days, this place?
That's up to you to decide how you think the star system has been changed. So to recap, the star system was, or is the idea that a singular architect takes credit for everything that's created in his office. So when we think of Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe and Corbu, those are what we call starchitects because they have been raised above every other architect in their contemporary circle. And they're called stars because, again, they burn so bright that they pretty much make everyone else around them invisible and the contributions of people around them. And so we attribute all the work of a singular office to a singular individual, which we still see with an architect like Frank Gehry today. If you don't know Frank Gehry, he's the one that created the Brain Center over on Charleston or Bonneville. And Frank Gehry at this point is 95 years old, so we know that he's not actually the only designer in the office making all of these pieces. But when people see any of the buildings coming out of his office, they still say, oh, it's a Frank Gehry piece, even though he probably doesn't see half of the pieces that come out of there. But because the firm has that name on its front door, Frank Gehry, in some ways, his practice still upholds the practice of architects. Now, how has it changed? Well, we see that firms are now starting to have non-principal related names. So here in Vegas, there's a firm called Bunnyfish or Blue Heron. Some of them are what we call alphabet soup firms. So TSK, OTA, where it's just the letters of the principal's last names. And though it still has a relationship to the principal in some way, it's at least not as direct as first name and last name. So it's kind of like what the Eames office did, where they removed Charles, so it wasn't the Charles Eames office, it was the Eames office. And today we're seeing that the firms are adopting those names in order to begin to break down that star system. Now, how is it upheld though? Pritzker Prize still only gives it to the principal of the firm. It doesn't matter if they weren't involved in all the projects that they get awarded for, they only give it to an individual. So you can argue that question either way you want. If you believe that it has completely changed, you can say that. If you believe that there's still a long way to go, you can say that as well. Part of the assessment is asking you for your opinion, as long as you can back it up with facts and historical evidence that you see in both the text or that we've gone over in class. There's a lot of flexibility for how to answer a lot of these questions. Any other questions? Yes?
This time we bring a test booklet, right?
Yes, test booklet. I did want to talk to you guys about exams since we do have a couple more minutes. So last time, we did multiple choice. You guys didn't do all that well. I talked to a couple people and they told me that it just didn't work out for them. But then I made it written and I heard everyone's reaction to it when I said we're having a written exam. Most people didn't seem to like it. So by show of hands, how many of you guys prefer multiple choice over written? And how many of you prefer the written exam over the multiple choice? All right. So think about what to do for the next one. Maybe we do a hybrid. Maybe I'll give you guys a choice. I'll have to come up with something to make everyone happy. I don't want to test you guys on something if you're not, happy with the formatting of it. I personally like written just because I feel like it gets you to think about it a little more than multiple choice, but everyone's a little bit different. So we'll see what we do for the next unit. For the Las Vegas unit, since it's only 2 weeks long, I'm not going to test you on it formally. I'm going to test you on the Vegas with the desert unit in conjunction, so you won't have another exam until probably like late April to worry about. So I'll have some time to figure it out, and I'll ask you guys some questions about how we feel about different formats before then. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there an extra credit question on this test?
Do you guys want an extra credit question?
Yes.
Okay, sure, let's do an extra credit question. Let's do it for, not full credit, because they're like 15 points. Maybe like half credit or something. Yeah, how does that sound? Okay, yes.
For extra credit question, is it like one extra question from like every category that we pick?
So on the exam, it'll be 2 and 2, and then you pick 1 and 1. So if you just pick one of the extra ones that's floating around on the page,
Okay.
that would be the extra credit. And so it's not one per category, just one overall, like last semester.
Yes.
Okay, makes sense? All right, yes.
So, on the exam, when we're picking our categories, is there one question is tied to another? So if we pick one, we have to pick this other one? Or is it
No.
gonna be-
No, they're independent, so I can pull it up.
Are they all gonna be on there, or are you gonna pick the two?
I'm gonna pick the 2. Only because I put them all on there, and I tell you guys I'm putting them all on there. There's people that will fill out their exam booklet, and then they'll just turn it in when they come in, so that's why I have to do that. And even then, I did have some people last semester that filled it out, and then they would just cross out the ones that they weren't answering and turn it in. So don't do that, please come in with a blank book. Okay, so, yeah, the way it works is there's 2 categories, general. So with these, again, you can, put your opinion into it as long as you can back it up. And then you have your reading questions, each of them pertaining to one of the texts that I've attached. On the exam, I'll pick 1 or 2 of these. Sorry, not 1 or 2, 2 of them, and we'll tell you which ones. And then you guys will have the opportunity to answer any one of the extra ones that you see on there. So your submission would only be 2 questions, 1 per category, and if you want the extra credit, you can just pick whichever extra one, whether it's in the general or the reading category. Is that clear? Okay, any other questions? Okay, if you guys have questions, you can just email me between now and Thursday, otherwise I'll see you then for your assessment.